that's okay with everyone else. I would like to call to order the January 8th, 2018 meeting of the Madison Metropolitan School District Board of Education Instruction Work Group. And the first order of business is public appearances, and we have one public appearance from Chris Gomez-Schmidt. And you have, once you get started, you have 3 minutes. Let me know when you're ready. You know to put the green light on the microphone, and welcome and Happy New Year.
Thank you. To you too. Okay, good to see everybody. Thank you for continuing to grapple with this issue as far as how to measure student achievement and how to measure and make sure that we're holding the district accountable for what we're doing with students. So I had a list of 10 things, and it's sitting on my printer at home, so I'm going to try to, I was almost organized for tonight. A couple things that I just wanted to make note of. Just concerning the growth metrics, I'm just really going to encourage you to find something that we can use that is easily understandable, visually understandable for people, just so that it's not something so complex that it's really hard to figure out what you're trying to do with it. I am concerned for the growth, looking at the growth and talking about advanced learners or students that are on both sides of proficiency. The whole discussion about regression to the mean, and that is a statistical reason for what we're seeing at both ends of the spectrum. I'd like you to really try to take a look at what other reasons there might be for this regression that you're seeing, and students not making the growth goals that we would expect for them to make. Last, I'm not sure if you're talking, or not last, but I'm not sure if you're talking about this tonight or not, but in regards to forward versus map, I really think that you need to keep the map test for our district. Measure of academic progress is what it is, and it is useful for measuring the progress that all students are making. If you need to, take a step back and decide if, as a district, is the goal to make sure all students cross the proficiency line, or is the goal to make sure that all students are growing from where they begin? Some students start way below proficiency and may not make it to that line, but they are making growth, and that's what we want to see. Some students start above proficiency, and we need to make sure that those students are growing in their learning because they're showing up to school every day, and those students deserve to learn something new every day too. As far as that growth metric, I don't think that having a metric for advanced students that basically says we just don't want you to fall back below advanced is good enough. It has to be something more substantial. And whether you can do that with the MAP growth goals or not is something that's going to have to be figured out. As far as what students are able to achieve, I just wanted to make a note that there are students in other districts and at other schools that are performing rather highly on MAP, and they still make growth, academic growth. And so I think we really need to take a close look at what we are doing for advanced students and really make sure that we are looking at how we're going to provide advanced instruction for those students before we start getting rid of metrics that we're worried that are not showing us what we want to see. All right, thank you.
Thank you. There's been a suggestion, and I will entertain a motion to flip items 4 and 5 on our agenda. Oh, we have an approval of the minutes. We'll do that first. Actually, we can flip. I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor of switching 4 and 5 on the agenda, say, Laura, your advisory vote?
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, that passes. We have flipped that. Now we have, I will also entertain a motion to approve the minutes dated November 6, 2017.
So moved.
Is there a second? Laura, your advisory vote?
Aye.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That passes 7-0. Okay, so number 5 on our agenda, or number 4 now, is the Student Services Allocation Model RFP and related items. I'm not quite sure what we're doing with this here. So Lisa, Jen, John,
Thank you, TJ. Appreciate that. I'm going to pass it right over to Lisa and John. We thought we'd give you a brief update on the RFP process. We know there's a lot of interest in this particular RFP for good reasons, and entertain any questions before we get into the bigger, meatier goals and metrics conversation. So I'll pass it over to you guys.
Yeah, so thank you, Jen. We wanted to provide the board with an update about where we're at in our process to secure a group to come in and really study our and make some recommendations for tools, data, and ways of efficiently using our resource allocations in support of all of our student service supports and resources. So that's resources and supports for students in special education, and then also resources and supports for our behavior education plan. So we have gone through our initial rubric of scoring for all of the vendors that have submitted. We will be engaging in interviews over the next 2 weeks and hope to come back to you at the end of the month with a recommendation at the final full board meeting. Anything else, John?
That's pretty much it.
First me and then Nikki. I think just in general that I had the opportunity to meet with John and Lisa on this and some other related things on last week. And one of the things that I found useful, and other board members might also, is to talk to them about what's important to you with this to inform their interview process. And so, you know, and I'll say that I emphasize that people who have a commitment and a record of success with around inclusive practices that lead to student achievement. You know, the two pieces, inclusion without student achievement is meaningless, and so that was and I said, you know, push that. But so now Nikki, and then did Kate have?
Will we get the results before the board meeting? So if you've decided to hire someone, would we get that ahead of time?
Certainly, yes.
And
You would see the scoring rubric in our recommendation, and then it would come before the board on the 29th, I believe.
And second question, well, just on what TJ said, and what I'd like to see is inclusive practices. My major issue on the last one was any group that has a table on how much money they can save on teaching students in a non-inclusive manner is something that's kind of a non-starter for me, because you kind of look at it and go, no, if we want every student career, college, and community ready, that means every student. It doesn't just mean those who are less expensive to educate.
Guess this is going quick. Going what, Jen?
I will just comment, I think that's a really good point, and that is certainly not the reason we launched the RFP. This wasn't born out of becoming more cost-effective, although obviously we always want to do that in a district with limited resources, but it is about the most effective allocation, distribution of resources. So your point is well taken, Nikki.
I would also add that we're really clear. I think we were clear in the RFP, and we'll be clear as we interview these folks, is we have our own values as a district around how we serve students in special education, and we have our own data, right? So we're really looking at how do you convert those values to a resource strategy? You know, we didn't bid out the values. We bid out a project to actually help us with the tools and the resources and the data and the transparency. Didn't bid it out for a cut or a reduction. I just want to be really sure that, you know, we are all on the same page. We are an inclusive. We believe in that really firmly, and whoever we hire works for us with our values and our data, and we're not looking at someone to change what we believe in. We just want to be sure that how we convert our resources to support kids is being done with the most transparency and in the greatest support of kids moving forward.
Anna?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciate you sending it back out and also revising the first one to include our commitment to inclusive education rather than leaving it out, because I do think that's a key value for our school district that any organization that we work with should be on board with.
All right, any other comments, advice? And we wish you the best with the interviews, and let's hope that they're as responsive as you've been.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, we have a short agenda tonight, but kind of an important one, a very important one. And we also have a meeting following this, which is also on the strategic framework work. I'll do a quick introduction, then turn it over to the superintendent, and then to the metrics team in particular. And I guess that I think that for the rest of the board, I think that the way we're going to do this is we're going to work through the information that's been provided by the administration with appropriate pauses and discussions where that belongs. And at the end, and I'd like to save this for the end, which is have a what's missing discussion. That other things that the board members or you've heard from community members that you either believe needs to be included or just think needs to be discussed and considered for inclusion, because we're nearing the time when putting something new into the mix becomes, if not impossible, a really bad idea. So, as we go through this, ask you all to think about it and also to save that to the end to respect the presentation materials in the order that's in. So that's my plan.
That sounds great to us as well. As a reminder, and Bo will maybe say a few more words on this, we're at kind of a midway point in terms of considering a strengthened set of goals and metrics for the next strategic framework. This is some of the most important work that a board does. These will be the goals and metrics by which you hold us accountable for the next, phase, however many years we decide that's going to be together, and potentially 5 years, just like this first framework was for the last 5 years. Yeah, it's a big deal. We started the discussion in December. We're continuing it tonight. We'll have another discussion in February. We want you to know, and maybe the public to know, that, because this is the board's work, you're kind of seeing the sausage making happen in action, right? It's a bit messy. We're in this midpoint, and it's supposed to be. And we're excited about sharing some new ideas coming out of the last meeting, getting more of your ideas tonight so that we can bring back an even stronger set of goals and metrics at the February discussion. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Bo.
All right.
Yeah?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay.
So thanks for the setup, Jen. I want to thank all of you for your engagement in this process as we continue to work through this. We know there's a lot to think about, a lot of great ideas out there, and we've had continued engagement as we go, so that definitely helps us refine the work we're doing, and we appreciate that feedback we've gotten. So we wanted to start as we get the slides pulled up here. There we go. Perfect. All right. With a quick recap of the work that we have done to date on this project. So as a reminder, this is part of our ongoing work with the upcoming strategic framework that we've all been collectively working through. And our team's primary responsibility here has been to think about the goals and metrics that we're going to use as a district, to think publicly in our public reporting how we're talking about the ways that we're succeeding and making progress. So what we've done so far, September through November, we engaged in a best practice and research review. We worked to collect some internal feedback that we used to put together a set of preliminary recommendations that we brought to the December instructional work group meeting. At that point, we collected your feedback, and from there, we have kind of continued to work on this. And so for tonight's meeting, we're going to begin our discussion of what we see as the major outstanding issues that we're continuing to work through, with an end goal of trying to have a working draft of a system of goals and metrics in February. So that's where we've been, a little bit about where we're going in the near future. So again, to make sure we're grounded on where we have been, this is the system that we brought to the board in December, and I'll just go through this really quickly so we all have kind of the same conception of where we've been working from since the last meeting. So goal 1, we recommended, stating is every child being on track to graduate ready for college, career, and community. Conceptualizing this as reading and math proficiency in grades K through 11, looking at 4-year high school completion rates, and then thinking about developing a graduate vision survey to help us think about the percent of students that we think are on track toward achieving those qualities that we as a community decided that we value. For the second goal here, we stated that as the district and every school in it being a place where children, staff, and families thrive. And so under this goal, we had 3 metrics there that we're viewing as power questions from the student, staff, and parent climate surveys. The examples that we brought in December kind of reflect this concept of our schools being a positive place where people want to be, enjoy being there. We know we had some feedback that we may want to think about those concepts a little bit, so we'll do that again as we work in February. And then finally, this metric of the percent of students with 90% attendance rate or better. Again, something where we got some feedback that we want to continue working on this. It's part of what we'll talk through tonight. The third goal in that initial set of recommendations was to accelerate progress for African American children and youth. At that point, we didn't have any specific metrics associated with that goal, but that's something that we've continued to work on, and we'll talk about again tonight as well. So there's a couple things that we wanted to emphasize before we really dive into some of the specific issues that we were going to talk through. So again, we want to be clear with everybody that there's a difference between a public accountability system, which is what we're talking about tonight, and an internal assessment system, the kinds of things that are happening in our schools on a day-to-day basis. So there are summative assessments that you might think of as things that we'd use for accountability. There are progress monitoring assessments, formative things that are going on a day-to-day basis with our teachers in our schools. So just because we don't see something here doesn't mean we don't think it's a valuable practice for the district to continue, doesn't mean it's not something we want to see continuing to happen on a day-to-day basis. What we're talking about here is that public system of goals and metrics associated with the strategic framework. We also want to talk again about how we want to think about having a package of metrics that are complementary and balanced. We don't want to be overly reliant on test scores. We don't want to be over-reliant on any one thing. We want to have a little bit of balance here to really express a lot of the ideas that we collectively value. And finally, something that we haven't really talked about yet in this process that I think is really important to keep in mind is that when we're building a system like this, there is some science to it, but there's also some art in the process. And so a lot of what our team has done is bring the science to this conversation. We've shown what things have looked like. We've put together some options that we think are reasonable, and we've used those processes to think about the kinds of things that we think are worth putting on the table. But there is art to designing a system like this, and sometimes that goes beyond just what the data shows. So that's part of what we're here to talk about tonight. That's part of how this process evolves, and that's part of the background that we want on the table.
Yep.
So as we think about these major outstanding questions that we think our team needs to continue to grapple with, there are 7 things that we have thought about right now that we'll focus on tonight and then in our February meeting.
And these are major questions that emerged from the last discussion with the board.
Yes, these are the things that emerged in December. So the first key piece of feedback that we wanted to talk about was that desire to figure out a growth metric that we might want to use. We've already heard some public comment on that, and so that's something that we'll be discussing tonight. A second big piece of feedback we got, that proposal to consider attendance with a 90% attendance rate goal. Some people brought up whether that was a high enough bar. Maybe we should be thinking about 95% instead. So that's something we'll be able to look at tonight as well. And then finally, our third goal around accelerating progress for African American children and youth. We heard the feedback that we might want to see some specific metrics associated with that goal, which were not part of the initial recommendation. So we're bringing some ideas to you all tonight as well that we'll have a chance to talk through. Coming back in February, we wanted to give a preview of some of these other issues that we are continuing to work on. Not discussions that we're planning on having tonight, but things where our team wants to put a little more work and thought in. We'll come back and talk in February about these. So the first one, our preliminary suggestions in December, included looking at what it would look like to use the forward assessment as our primary summative accountability assessment, that state mandated assessment rather than MAP. So that's something that we're planning to come back to. The second is whether we want to think about using ACT and Aspire in grades 9 through 11, or whether we might want to use GPA instead. So again, we'll do a little more work there, and we'll come back. Third is this idea of power questions on the climate survey. So what are the key concepts that we want those climate survey questions to capture? And finally, putting a little more thinking in to early literacy assessments and continuation with PALS as our primary assessment in grades 4K through 2, or whether we might suggest using something else moving forward. So the first thing that we wanted to talk through tonight is this growth metric. So as I said earlier, we received feedback from this group and from others in December that we might want to think about adding a growth metric in. So over the past 5 years, we've been using that MAP typical growth target, which is based on similar students nationally, similar grade levels, starting scores, whether you're kind of keeping pace with the typical national gain pace from fall to spring. So we'd heard feedback about that metric over the last 5 years that made us think maybe that's not exactly what we want to do moving forward. And then we heard your feedback in December that we'd like to try something. So we have put some work into this, and we're bringing forward a suggestion that's basically a tiered approach based on students' prior scores and their percentile improvement. So the idea here is that if in the prior year a student scored in that below basic or minimal level, kind of that lowest result band, we'd want to see them improving 10 percentile points or more. And I want to be clear that when we're talking about percentile improvements here, we would be using national scores or statewide scores. We know percentile improvements using district scores only is just kind of shuffling things around, doesn't actually represent progress. So what we're talking about here is the percent of students that are kind of making progress percentile-wise to a larger group of students. Then thinking for students who scored in basic the prior year, improving 5 or more percentile points. Students who had scored proficient, improving 2 or more percentile points. And then for students who scored in that advanced result range, having the goal of maintaining an advanced score. So when we think about students scoring advanced, it's generally the 90th percentile or above, around there. So I wanted to talk through, before we have a chance to discuss this, a little bit about why we think this helps us push the envelope and set, in some ways, even a higher standard than that MAP growth target that we have been using over the past 5 years. So some of the feedback that we had gotten around MAP growth is that, that metric was about keeping pace nationally, and that doesn't necessarily mean you are making progress toward proficiency. If we don't see students progressing toward proficiency nationally, then just meeting that MAP growth target doesn't mean our students are progressing that way either. So what we've tried to do here is come up with a suggestion that represents, for students scoring in those below basic, minimal, or basic ranges, if we make this progress over time, we're not just keeping pace with national trends, we're improving how we're doing relatively and making progress toward proficiency. And for proficient students, continuing to make progress toward an advanced result as well. So in that sense, we are talking about really a higher standard than MAP growth, and something that does represent progress toward proficiency, progress toward gap closing. If we see students meeting these targets, we'll see those things happening. I wanted to explain quickly the graphic that we used in support of this. We know it's kind of complicated and there's a little bit to work through there, so I'll just talk through it briefly. And when we're talking about using this as a metric, this isn't how we're talking about reporting it publicly or anything like that. You'd expect to see percents of students meeting these goals just the way we have in the past. So we just wanted to bring this data to bear to show kind of, again, bringing our science to the conversation, why we think something like this is borne out by how the data looks. So what we see here, this is just an example of reading an aggregate over the past few years of MAP scores, but you'll see similar trends when you look at other assessments too. The little orange dots, which are a little clearer to see in the digital version, represent percentiles in the prior year. And those blue dots represent percentiles the subsequent year, and then they're connected by bars. So when we see a longer bluer bar, that represents greater improvement year to year. And when we see those orange bars, that represents, at least in percentile terms, a little bit of decline from year to year. And I do want to be clear too that seeing a decline in percentiles does not mean a decline in performance or knowledge or the skills that a student is able to exhibit. It's about kind of that percentile compared to national score distributions. So what I think we see in this data that actually is pretty positive for some progress the district has made over the last few years is that, when we think about this idea of regression toward the mean that was brought up a little bit earlier, basically that's the idea that when we see extreme results, either very positive or very negative, they're just going to tend to be a little less extreme next time. So this is kind of a statistical concept that's been proven many times over. When you have an extreme result, it just doesn't tend to be that extreme the next time. So when we see students, at the lower end of proficiency results, we see greater progress toward proficiency, greater gains as we go back towards a less extreme result. And at the very top level, those students in the highest percentiles, we do see, again, on average, certainly not for all students, we have lots of students that are continuing to make breakthrough growth even after they hit that 90th percentile and above. But on average, you will see some scores there regressing back toward a less extreme result. So if we were a district that were not helping students move at all, if all we were observing from one test administration to another was just kind of regression back towards more typical results, what we'd see here is we wouldn't see longer blue bars than we see orange bars, and we'd see kind of that flip point from blue to orange happening around the 50th percentile as we watched everybody's scores just kind of regress back towards normal, which is what you tend to see when you administer tests multiple times. So we all know that a standardized test is one point in time, and it reflects a lot of things that a student knows, but it also just reflects some things that are happening that day. We all have good days and bad days, and students' test scores, when they're tested over time, they're going to tend to fall within a range, but they're not always going to be exactly the same. So what we actually see in our data is we see some pretty long blue bars for students scoring, in the 30th percentile or below, which suggests that, we have some decent progress toward proficiency happening there. And we don't see a flip at the 50th percentile. We actually see that happening a little bit higher. So I know there's kind of a lot there to think about and chew on, but we did want to take this visual way of kind of thinking about what that looks like, and I do think it is fairly positive. Yeah.
So can we get feedback just on the proposed metric for a minute, as opposed to the data, but the metric itself?
Actually, just a housekeeping question. Next time, is it possible to make the black bars a little brighter? It's a little harder to read.
Yeah, sure.
It was just a housekeeping matter.
Yep.
Kate?
Thank you for your presentation, Bo. And so I appreciate what you said in the beginning of kind of how framing these metrics around public accountability. It's actually a good starting off point, I think, for this metric. So I appreciate the regression to mean. I appreciate that the math works. I also find it unacceptable for us as a district to say it's okay for students to show up and not grow over the course of a year and call that success, right? That may happen, but I don't think that we as a district can call that our goal, our success. And so, I would like to find a metric here that continues to show evidence of success and intervention, right? That we actually did something, that we were better than a kid not showing up at school for a year, because that doesn't quite show up here. So I do believe it's still possible to show growth even within the advanced kind of tier. Maybe that's not the best metric. Maybe you guys have a different suggestion, but I just don't think it's acceptable for us to say our goal for 15% of our students, so 15% of our students live in this tier, right, is no learning, no demonstrable learning, right? So I don't know.
Mary?
Just a clarification, because I didn't understand it to be that there was no growth.
No, I don't think it is. I don't think
there's
it represents.
Didn't they made 1 year? They stayed at the same advanced level and had a year of growth.
Yes, it's in the longer description, it's right. We want to maintain the tier, even if your percentage is going down, right? So it's within the tier. not the
Yeah.
number.
And so because
Right.
maintaining that tier from year to year does require a higher standard, higher score.
So it's-
You know, we are talking about making,
It's that the percentage would
Growth.
go down, but the tier would
Yeah,
stay
they're
the
making
same.
You're
growth. I
learning.
just didn't, I mean, to say that the students aren't learning anything
I think
is,
I'm going to step in here for a second and say that I think that the measure as it is now, that maintaining within the advanced tier, for some students would mean absolutely zero change in RIT score. Because there are students who are in the advanced tier in 6th grade who already have a score that puts them in the advanced tier for the 7th grade and puts them in advanced. So for some students, it would be, and you know, I have no sense of what percentage those are, and more generally do agree with Kate that there's a message being sent here. That, and I think that there is room, and I also kind of have a message around, I think I'm going to back up a little bit. Begin with, I like the tiered approach because among other
Yeah.
things, what it does is that it puts some focus on our students, on accelerating growth for those at the bottom. And I like that. This balance among how we define the tiers, I think that all tiers should have some, we should call success something which is an expectation of improvement. And maybe at the top tier, it's, you know, some students, again, will be at 350 RIT score in 6th grade, and there's nothing you can do. And they'll be at, but there should be, we should measure those who moved from the 92nd percentile to the 94th percentile, or some kind of, you know, whether it's 2-3 point improvement at the advanced level. Right now, I think at the proficient level, we have a 2-point goal. You know,
Yeah,
maybe
it could be
up that
two
to
for
3 or
both.
4, right?
Exactly, that, I mean.
And those,
we
and
can
you
talk
know,
about
and
that
maybe
too.
up
Yeah.
the basic to 5, from 5 to 6 or something like that. I think that balance is something that we need to play with.
Yeah.
And I think that, and then just, I very, very much appreciate the examples that you gave on short notice today, and those have been posted on board docs if they weren't there earlier, but they're there now. And I think that one of the things that when we talk about whether it's a public metric or an internal metric is, what does this look like in practice? And we now have some examples that break this down for multiple years, multiple tiers, and multiple demographics. And I think that becomes very useful because the question is, what is this showing us, and what is it hiding from us, right? I mean, and one of the things it's hiding is how our advanced learners are moving. I think that does raise the question of how we interpret things, and one of the things that jumped out at me from the example was that there was a lot of volatility around the math numbers, and I guess I don't know how to interpret that. And sometimes having a volatile measure is really good. And I guess I'd like to, you know, what possible ways should we interpret that volatility on there? And just very quickly, goes from what, 48 to 50. Goes from what, 50 to 40?
Yeah, so
I don't have it in front of me.
approximately 50 to 47 and then 47 to 48, 46 to 50, 51, somewhere in there. So there's a couple comments I'd make there. You know, one, we wanted to make, you know, the visual changes pretty clear, but I do want to be clear that, you know, if we look at the x-axis there, it's a relatively small percentage range we're talking about. So not that, you know, 46 to 50 isn't something that's meaningful and important, but
actually, I'm looking here and it's 40 to 53. I've got about 48 in 20 on the thing you sent today. In 2014, I've got 48 overall district score percentile. Then I'm down to 40 for 2015-16.
oh, you're talking about the percent that we're meeting the target.
Yes, and that's very volatile.
Sure, yeah, no, that's fair.
I mean, that's a 13-point.
So it is, yeah, and you know, we have seen some pretty volatile moves in the percent meeting map growth targets as well too.
Yeah.
So when we're
They're
talking
very
about, you know,
volatile.
year-to-year improvement, you know, something like this, it's gonna maybe be a little more volatile sometimes than proficiency rates are, which take longer to move. You know, in terms of kind of the specifics of why we're seeing those shifts from year to year, that's probably better spoken to for someone on the instructional side. You know, I do know we see a very nice gain there for math from the 15-16 to the 16-17 school year. Got good feedback on the Bridges math curriculum and things like that. So, but yeah, you know, I think it's fair to note that there is a little bit of volatility there, but I think growth metrics are going to be a little volatile. I mean, when we look at something like, value-added modeling that we see being used on the DPI accountability report cards, those growth scores are all over the place from year to year.
Yeah.
So just when you're looking at growth, because it does kind of start from zero every year, and we're talking again about growth over the next time period. Proficiency is kind of an aggregation of skills over time. Growth is going to reset every year, so it may move a little more.
Kate?
Just to follow up, I think the tiered approach in general is pretty good, and while I think I'm pretty open to like a 2-point growth for the advanced tier, it may be that a different metric is more appropriate. I think the overall goal here should be for us to show evidence that we've done something, right? Beyond what would have been expected if we didn't have, say, an advanced learning program. But we have a program, and our goal as a district is to support students to be challenged every day when they show up at school, no matter how they show up at school. And so if there's a different metric that works better to demonstrate that, that's fine. But I think we do need some way to say we've done something here, right? We have a program, and it is pushing our kids.
Nikki?
What I'm just worried about is, I agree with Kate to a point, but I'm afraid if we use multiple metrics, we're going to lose the side of it.
Simplicity. Yeah. We did talk about extending the 2% proficiency goal, or the goal for the proficient group to the advanced group. So I think that might be a clean way to address the issue. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
I did kind of hear a response to another of my concerns, which is that looking both at the demographic breakdown and the tier breakdown, and again, I've only had this since this afternoon, so it's very, but one of my one of the reasons, the reason I asked for that was that a concern that when we look at the overall district score, that we can look good as a district, but that positive stuff is coming from a very small subset of our students, and that in fact a larger subset is either falling further behind or staying steady. And so I guess, can you kind of talk through your understanding of how this metric combats that or seeks not to have that happen?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And, I think kind of when we talk about metrics and what they mask and what they show, I think a lot of that is just played out in the way that we report and discuss results as well, the ways we disaggregate and the ways that we share results. So if there's things that we're concerned about being masked, we can talk about how we want to present that to make sure that we reveal it, because really any metric, that kind of detail is going to come out in the way that you present it, the way you disaggregate it, and the way that you plan around it. So, I think what this metric does in a positive way to help fight that is, that tiered approach and having an expectation of higher growth for students with lower previous results. I mean, we had talked in the past about how, that MAP growth metric, as we were using it, could be masking, even expanding gaps in some cases, because if those gaps are expanding nationally, students with lower scores who are keeping pace with national trends aren't necessarily closing anything. So I think that's the biggest way that we're helping to kind of avoid that, is by setting that higher standard for students who at least have lower test scores the previous year. We're making sure that we're not treating that as a success when all they're doing is keeping pace with statewide and national trends we might be concerned with.
Yeah.
I guess that this kind of raises one of the things is that one of the other trade-offs is simplicity of reporting versus depth of reporting, right?
Yeah.
And I guess I'd like to, if we go with a tiered metric like this, I'd like us to consider reporting out the contributions of the separate tiers like you did in response, in addition to doing the subgroups.
Yeah.
Because I think that one of the things that is striking here is that when we do look at the lower tiers, that 10-point is very ambitious, and only looking like about 20% of students are meeting it for math, and about 30 for reading depending on the year. And so, you know, if our overall score is, you know, 54%, but that, and I guess again, it comes to it. So I think that we should,
Yeah.
if we do go with a tiered approach, we should consider doing this kind of reporting.
Yeah, no, that's reasonable. And, you know, I think that's a good example of where the art comes in here too, because, you know, we know when we're recommending that percentile point, that 10 percentile point improvement, I mean, that's as much a
It's
value
ambitious.
statement as something that is, you know,
Yep.
borne out by the data. This isn't a recommendation that represents the average scores we've been achieving over years. This is thinking about what it looks like to achieve proficiency. So, you know, the result may be, if we do set a very ambitious target for some students, it may be a little harder to hit, and that's where the art comes in. So.
Mary?
Thank you. And Bo, I have to applaud particularly the update, the response to the board questions, along with the asking the questions that got the response, because it's really valuable. And and looking at the one that breaks it down by the tiers, I'm pretty surprised at how that average tiered improvement, if I would say, is almost misleading as to how, whether students actually have learned more and are advancing beyond, are improving. And so you see, for example, that in the advanced category in reading, where scores went backwards, if I'm reading this, or just on the percentile, declined, I should say, that the average tiered improvement was the best for that group in reading. And so if I'm looking, and the question it raises to me is, are we actually using these numbers to basically say how we're doing? Because the lowest scores are where we had the best improvement. And I don't know about most people, but I'm not sure how many people have the quantitative aptitude to get these, to understand these numbers. And it sort of frightens me that that we'd be using those types of numbers.
Mary, so this is actually where my poorly worded statement came from. So the goal was backwards improvement was acceptable for advanced. And so that goal, 70% of advanced tier children stayed within advanced but went backwards.
But
So
what
that's
I'm
why-
what
that's why it
I'm
was such a high-
understanding with the growth, though, is that when you say, and this is a question, because my understanding when you say that for advanced learners, when it's zero change, basically, that we're not referring to the gray dots, we're referring to the blue-red dots, which would basically be that the same percentage, that group of students, the same percentage would not change from year to year. Or are you saying that we're using, in fact, the gray dots to measure growth?
So I think what we'd be proposing is these gray dots would be the metric, so the percent of students. that are
Geez,
meeting.
I completely misunderstood that then. I'm glad we're talking about it, because I don't understand how we'd use, those gray dots, to me, seem to are
Can I
very
interrupt for a second
confusing.
And ask that if we can get the slide we're talking about up on
Yeah.
the screen?
That would be really helpful.
Because if,
These responses, when did they come out?
This afternoon,
Yeah, as a rule of thumb, when it's.
it's difficult, it's difficult, yeah.
we were asked to post them.
You guys are actually discussing something here that, I mean, I'll just come up, I haven't seen it.
Well, I've just seen it, I just pulled it up and I'm looking at it now. So I didn't see it prior to the meeting.
Yeah, we
This is the
received the
board growth
questions
question
today.
response. One is the document we're looking for on board docs. And if we can.
It is.
And, you know, this is, there was some miscommunication around this, that I anticipated that part of the meeting we'd have, the pre-meeting on Friday, would be discussing this and talking about the kind of information that would be good to get to the board as soon as possible. Because that wasn't how it was scheduled, I said, okay, well, I'll submit some questions via email. I didn't get those submitted till Saturday because it was Friday afternoon and I didn't have a chance. And you know, and Bo did real nice work turning stuff around fast, but it still is very, very late for a Monday meeting, and there's no question about that. But
I'll look at it going
yeah,
forward, but I haven't seen it as of now. I'm not going to sit here and try to be thorough about it.
That's it.
Yeah.
So that's the page we're looking at.
So my understanding is that those gray dots mean 70% of advanced students stayed within the advanced tier, even if the absolute percentage, as is shown on the left, went back. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
Okay. As was the proposed
Yeah,
metric.
so some may have seen their percentile increase, some may have seen it decrease, but remain within that advanced range. Yeah.
And that would mean 30% would have gone out of the advanced range, would have declined more. Okay.
That made sense.
So I'll just
James.
make a
So,
The statement is, since I have not seen this data, and I'm not going to sit here and try to go do a thorough analysis of it here during the meeting, is that where I was coming into the meeting was that I'm thoroughly still in the camp of we should not be getting rid of the MAP approach that we have historically used and the 5 years of data that we've accumulated. So that's why I was coming in. And I'm still in that camp because I haven't had a chance to thoroughly go over this information. So I'm still in that camp. So you all can discuss these tiers. But, I mean, I don't see stuff after 12 o'clock on that.
Mary?
so in clarification, would this is the approach, and it says using MAP or whatever's used. It's just the approach, it's not the source of the data.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, the data that you're seeing here is an example of MAP over the past few years. But, you know, an approach like this based around percentiles is, you know, adaptable to other tests.
So why would we also be setting targets based on the improvement, like the bars, rather than the dots?
I don't think so, and I do apologize for confusion that may have caused. The idea behind what we wanted to show there is just what average percentile improvements have looked like over time. I'm not proposing that as the metric. It's just kind of background data to inform, you know, if we're talking about using this, are students getting there? Is this a lot more than we've been seeing, a lot less than we've been seeing historically? So the idea is, you know, these gray dots showing the percent of students meeting that tiered improvement goal as we laid it out for this meeting. That's what we're thinking of as a metric.
And we wouldn't use the change in the percentage of those that are proficient? Or, maybe you should explain to me, because I got the gray dots wrong. Can you make sure I understand the blue and the red dots?
Yeah, sure. So, and I'm sorry too, because this was a supplemental document, so we didn't redo all the keys on this. So basically what you're seeing with the orange dot is the average percentile the prior year for students who scored within that band. So when we look in minimal, we see those 3 orange dots there, shows that the average minimal student was around the 8th, 9th percentile. And then that blue dot shows you their average percentile the next year. So that typical student scoring minimal is moving from around the 8th percentile to around the 12th, maybe.
So thank you, Bo.
Sure,
Without giving it, spending a lot of time on it, my first initial reaction is I would rather be looking at the average student and how they have progressed for those categories than I would about what percentage of students within a category improve. Is that what the gray dots measure?
Yeah.
So, because in that case, if you take, let's just take the minimal, is that if we say our goal is 10% of the students within that band improve, we're basically saying we could hit our benchmark and 90% of students wouldn't show any improvement.
I'm sorry. No, the goal would be for students within that band to improve 10 percentile
At least
points.
10 percentile points.
So they're in the 10th percentile the year before. We want to see them get to the 20th percentile or higher. So it's not about 10% of them improving. It's about all of them improving 10 percentile points.
Okay.
And then we would set a goal to say that, right now, looking at this, we'd probably set a goal that, last year it was 30% of our students in the minimal band improved. If we set it by band, which we probably wouldn't, but
Probably not, but yeah.
But improved 10 or more percentage points. This year, we would like to see 35% improved, or 40% or whatever. That would be probably how the goal would be set, depending on the negotiations around that.
Right. Yeah.
Now, at the advanced learner level, it would be, as Mary said, that the goal would be, and as Kate said,
Sure.
So,
after Mary.
I can
No,
wait.
Laura after Mary. That's all. I was just.
I'm still trying to understand the numbers. So, then when we say that the minimal on math is somewhere just about 10%. What does that mean? 10% of what?
So I think when we're talking about that as a metric, it's if that minimal student was in the 10th percentile nationally, then that means they outscored 10% of students nationally. Their score was better than 10%. We'd like the next year their score to be better than 20% of students in their grade. So that's how we're trying to recommend. So it's about relative performance.
And so, did we discuss previously whether about going with relative performance versus proficiency?
We hadn't, not necessarily.
We still have the proficiency measure.
Yeah.
So there's a reading and math
right.
proficiency, and then the changes in proficiency level captures that.
So we're talking about this as an addition to what was there in December.
This
So
this
we
would
had a
replace.
conversation where you weren't here, which is probably.
No, I was on the phone, though.
Oh, okay.
The
Okay.
current,
Yeah,
this
I
would
was
replace the current metric, which is percentage of students meeting expected growth targets
That's right.
On map, yeah.
on MAP. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what this. But it
This is
wouldn't
the
replace
analog, yeah.
proficiency.
Right.
That's kind of the trade-off.
Right.
Yeah. And the former metric, expected growth on math, the major criticism was that it was really hard to understand. It was sort of a black box, and it was hard to explain. We're hoping this is actually a little easier to explain because it's simply moving up percentiles.
Yeah.
And we're looking for a simpler, more elegant way to measure growth.
And my criticism of the MAP growth was always that it was about not falling behind.
Right.
Right, yeah.
And I mean that, and so, and this at least
This
at
is about
the
making real growth.
minimal level
Yeah.
has a getting ahead or moving towards
Right.
getting ahead kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the,
And so that's, Laura and then Nikki.
So I just wanted to ask whether, what would account for the apparent regression of the advanced learner band in math and reading? Because I'm wondering if that is either like they hit a plateau effect or something where it's, or if it's just random variation, or if that's expected that kids would get an extreme value but then fall back. Like, what do you think explains that?
Yeah, I think it's a little of all of that. I mean,
Yeah.
when we are talking about a standardized test result, there's a lot of things that go into that result on any given day, and so there is just some randomness in scores. You're going to get different questions, you're going to have a different experience that day, And so, obviously a lot of what you're seeing in a test score is, what a student knows, but there is a little bit of chance in there as well. And so when we are talking about, how the next time you do a similar task but not exactly the same task, you may do a little differently. And, the reality is for students scoring in that advanced range, their scores are very, very high, and there's not a lot of room for that chance to be moving in the other direction. So, what this may be representing is, a few students who had a really good day, hate to say it, but, guessed correctly on a few questions, something like that, and have a result that is a lot higher than, what we might think is the typical performance that they're exhibiting. The next time they're tested, they're probably not going to chance into as extreme a result again. So I think that's a lot of it.
Sorry. Go ahead. My question is this: I understand we're trying to get a better, less complicated solution, please, because I'm sorry, I've been staring at these things and I'm still slightly confused, openly admitting that. But my question is this: if we're trying to move someone up from the 10th percentile to the 20th percentile, how do we know we're not teaching to the test? How do we know that we're not convincing teaching only what they need to do to be able to get a certain score? And can we prevent that?
Yeah, I think I'm best probably positioned to answer that question. And there are districts out there who do teach to the test and have, and we're not one of them. I mean, we have standards-based scopes in our district. That is what drives what teachers teach every day. There are districts, and certainly during the NCLB era, that did a ton of standardized test analysis, right? I mean, that's what teachers did with their time. They unpacked the standardized test results, did item analysis to figure out which students missed which questions and how they could game it to get a better result on the next test, and that's just not how we function. So it's just not how we run our schools, Nikki. It's certainly not the expectation. If we're teaching well, we think students will perform better on a variety of assessments, both formative and summative.
Thank you.
Andrew had something you wanted to say, and then Dean.
Yeah, I just wanted to back up just for 1 second. I think it speaks to trying to find a simple solution. If it helps an organizer, for all of our measures are the percentage of students that are doing something. So basically every measure we have is percentage of students that are at a certain reading level, percentage of students that are graduating, percentage of students that are showing up a certain percentage of the time, which is what we're going to talk about later. This is an improvement over the NWEA measure as we see it. NWEA with the MAP growth was the percentage of students that are keeping pace nationally. This is an improvement, which is the percentage of students that are growing more compared to national results. So in that, we need to figure out what the more than means, and that's how we came up with a tiered solution to say students with low proficiency levels would be expected to grow more, students with higher would be expected to grow less. But the organizer then is percentage of students doing something, and in this case, not just keeping pace, but actually accelerating compared to their national peers, if that helps.
It does.
It does, actually.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. That actually did help. Because I think in conversations outside of board meetings and even in presentations, we hear about the concern of the standardized tests and how, skeptically we all kind of look at them. So we're really, but someone at 10%, as Nikki mentioned, we don't really want to describe that we're teaching to the test. We're teaching to the growth, which is a different way of saying almost the same thing. The growth is what we're looking for, improvement. We're someone at 10 to 20%. We desperately and dramatically have to teach that child up. And it's measured somehow, and MAP works fine for that. But I don't care what you use to measure it. If someone's at 10 to 15%, we have to teach that. We have to take dramatic steps to move that child up, or we're going to lose them. Particularly if they're the younger they are, the quicker we move them up, they can get back on track. And So we have to teach to the growth, is what I would describe it as, and measure it somehow. And I'd be really lenient on how we measure that. If there's improvement going on and this kid is starting to get it and feel good and that test doesn't reflect it, I don't care. If the strategy we're using with that child is working, you keep at it. So it's not to the test, it's to the growth. And I think that's, if we say it that way, it reflects our practice better, I think.
Anna? And then I'm going to try and move us to the next place.
Yeah, sounds good.
Try.
Yeah. So I do like the tiered approach as well. I do think it's important to show that there's growth across all the tiers, basic through advanced, and not just saying it's flat at advanced. My question is in regard to just looking at the data that we received in regard to the ELL plan, and I think the special ed plan maybe was in there. I'm not sure. How will this dovetail? How will this information dovetail with these other the data that are coming out on an annual basis? Because I'm just looking at the ELL plan here, and the data is so, in my opinion, insufficient. So I'm wondering, where are we going to be capturing data for different groups in the district outside of this?
Yeah, so I think with all of our major plans, the ELL plan, Advanced Learner Plan, Special Education Plan, and so on, what we did with those updates that you've seen is capture those strategic framework milestones, the kinds of things we're talking about tonight, for the students most affected by that plan or are covered under that plan. And I think with all of this work, it can be really tempting to look at everything we can think of as constantly as possible. But I think what we want to try to do is allow a little room to breathe on some of these things. So when we think about that evaluation cycle that we're under as a district for major plans, every 3 years these plans receive a comprehensive evaluation where we have a chance to kind of dive into some of these bigger issues and more of the implementation measures as well. When we are thinking about annual updates on these plans, we do think things like the strategic framework milestones and some of the demographic things you saw are a nice pulse check that will help us see right away, as we're doing kind of regular monitoring, if there's somewhere where we need to start looking really quickly. But, knowing that progress is not, necessarily going to be linear and not always going to be evident on an immediate basis across all student groups, I'd personally advise for things like those plans, keeping those looks pretty similar to what we're doing district-wide, and then saving kind of the punch of the 3-year evaluation to dig in a little more at that point.
We certainly can talk about that more too, Anna.
Yeah. 2 things. First off, I'd like to say that I appreciate the discussions of around teaching the test, and do note that our district is not immune to pressures on people on test scores.
Yeah. That's right.
And pressures that are not always aligned with learning, but are aligned with metrics that we pick, and we have a responsibility to continually raise the awareness of the limitations of test scores as a measure, understand that there is learning, that we know that there is learning not measured by test scores, and that learning is what we're interested in, and communicating that consistently. So I appreciate those words from people, but also to acknowledge that people in our schools and our classrooms feel those pressures, and feel pressures to raise growth metrics and raise test scores that are, again, separate from what might be best for the students. Having made that statement, I do think that we need to have some kind of summary for where we are on the growth metric to give give Andrew and Bo and that team a place to go. And I'll try a summary of what I heard, which was that I heard a general favorability and no opposition to the idea of a tiered approach. I heard 2 or 3 people.
That's not true.
Okay. I was going to just say I heard 2 or 3 people who said that they're not yet and comfortable with understanding where this is at yet, and that the level of information. And I heard a continued desire for some growth metric. And James, if you want to correct me on that, on I think it was the second one.
I think we're in agreement of having a growth metric.
yeah.
And in fact, that your approach might in fact be the metric. I'm saying when you come out with some on a day of the meeting in the afternoon, I just think that's not how we do business.
No.
And that, so for those who had a chance to discuss this previously and help develop it, fine, but I hear other board members who probably need some more time to think
That was
about
my
it.
second point.
So-
That was exactly my second point. And what I said was no opposition, not unanimous support. I heard, which is different. I don't think anyone is said, I am not against a tiered approach, but I think there are some, that both the actual design of this and the general idea is something that where people have yet to develop a comfort level.
TJ, could I add?
Yeah.
It sounds to me, maybe you said this and I missed it, that there is some dissatisfaction with the advanced tier.
I was going to add
Yes.
that I think I hear
Yes.
that we as a district would like to
Yeah.
articulate
Expect
growth at all tiers.
Yep, that's what I heard too. Okay.
All right, I think we move on to something which I think is at least less complicated.
Should be. Yeah. Okay, yeah, and thanks for working through that with us. Again, we know that was kind of the most technically complex thing to work through. I do just want to comment too that the supplemental materials that we provided today are really about providing additional technical background to the recommendation that we had shared as part of the board materials. Doesn't change the recommendation, doesn't mean anything we shared in those original materials is different or inaccurate or untrue. This was just kind of a deeper technical dive under the hood of how we got there.
Yeah.
So that's what you'll see if you haven't had a chance to look through it yet. So transitioning to attendance, again, I think this is a little bit simpler issue to talk through. So in general, we heard people liked the idea of thinking about attendance, but 90% felt like a little bit too low of a bar. The idea was floated, maybe we want to consider using 95% instead. So what we've included here, the graphic on the right there, I know it's too small to read in the slide, but in the materials and the documents provided, it should be a little bit more legible. And what I'd say there is that the numbers themselves are not necessarily all that important. I think what that graphic shows is that if we use 90% as a target, we have a decent number of students who are meeting that and also a decent number of students who are not quite there yet. If we use 95% as the target, fewer students meeting it, but again, some are. We see variation across groups. So I think the way that I'd sum up our dig into the data here is that 95% and 90% are really both pretty defensible ways to do this, and this is where that art comes into the practice. So I think the science tells you both 90% and 95% look pretty decent, useful, show variation. They're not too close to 100 or 0 that we wouldn't expect to see things happening. So with that in mind, we're bringing forward a suggestion that maybe we try a tiered approach here, with elementary and middle schools having an attendance target for students of 95%. High schools, recognizing that there may be some different things happening, 90% as that attendance target.
Yeah, so there are three things that this measure does have in common with the last one. One is that we're still talking about art plus science to get the right decisions in place. We're talking about tiering. So various slices of the data demonstrate a rationale for tiering, just like the previous metric in the previous conversation. And then the third is we're still talking about a percentage of students doing something. So the percentage of students who are here 90% of the time, or percentage of students who are here 95% of the time. So that's different from a 90 or 95% attendance rate, but we are consistent in our measurement of the students and the percentage of the students that have a certain attribute or behavior, and in this case, it's attendance.
Nikki?
My issue on this, 95 sounds great. Here's my problem. One, we have a large number of homeless students who have concerns, and I'm worried that they could get lost in this metric. But number two, I worry that if we redefine what we consider our attendance, we change our truancy policy. As a public defender with juveniles, I see the majority of kids are in there for disorderly conduct or truancy. The problem being is it enters kids into a criminal justice system way too early, and I'm afraid that this number would be used to justify that, and that's my only concern. Otherwise, I would like the tiered approach because I think it's more understandable. I just worry that it can be used for purposes it shouldn't be used for.
Anna?
I think at the elementary level, I would actually see a lower attendance, particularly at the younger grades as kids are coming into the school and just being exposed to new germs and new spaces, I get a little bit concerned with like younger kids, because I think then that almost encourages families to send their kids to school sick. And I would just think as kids get older, they develop their immune system, but when they're younger, so that's my only thought.
Haven't we historically seen that kindergarten and first grade and like 11, 12 are the two highest
Absence.
Yes.
absence?
Yep.
Yeah.
So Anna, would that for you be an argument to keep the goal at 90% as originally proposed at elementary? Just wanted to make sure
If you want to target, more directly in elementary, but I would just think that you're going to see kids more absent at the younger grades.
James?
Back to TJ's point, when I was looking at these, like 90 and 95%, the thing that I thought about was, how did you come to the 90-95%? And your point was around the historical data. It'd just be good to know when we recommend these percentages, what's the thinking behind? Why did we choose 90-95%? What is the historical rate? Do elementary kids come to school at a 70% rate? So that would give me more information to make a decision around maybe what it should be. I don't offhand, I don't know what the historical attendance rate for elementary kids are.
Sure.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
90-95%, we throwing these percents out, but what's the justification? What are we using to come up with these numbers? And so that would be helpful to me.
Yeah. So, what we do see in the materials here is, I know it's not exactly an attendance rate, it's the percent of students that have met each of those tiers over the last 5 years. So we do see that at the elementary level, we see historically not just higher attendance rates in aggregate, but more students reaching 90% and 95% attendance than we have seen. Then middle school a little bit lower, high school a little bit lower than that. So 90% was our starting point for this recommendation because, conventionally, locally, nationally, you'll see 90% used as a cutoff for chronic absenteeism.
Yeah.
Missing 10% or more of school is just kind of general practice, the way that's considered. 95%, again, is a fairly commonly used number nationally. I don't think it's necessarily statistically derived. I'll say, too, that people like nice round numbers that end in zeros and fives. And so you see a lot of places goal setting around those. So these aren't, statistically derived. The 90% is our historic practice. The 95% is gut reactions to 90 being too low. What does 95 look like?
Yeah.
So that's why we did that.
Mary?
I was at least one of the ones who thought 90% was too low. I mean, that's one day every 2 weeks. I think Anna makes a good point. We certainly don't want people sending sick kids to school, and that we're putting pressure on to send your kids to school if they're sick. I appreciate the information that breaks it out by subgroup. And also understanding where we are overall. I think 90% is a reach, particularly when you break it out by subgroups. And so I'd have no problem keeping it at 90%, but I'd really, I would strongly encourage that our emphasis on addressing this is on the student groups that are the lowest.
Agreed.
Because frankly, it's shocking that nearly 35% of African American students are below 90% attendance.
Yeah.
When we talk about learning, you can't learn if you're not in school. And so what are those barriers that are being placed? Or what is that? We talk about engagement and relationships and whatever it is at school. So I'm fine with the supporting 90%, but with the special emphasis on the specific subgroups that aren't achieving that.
I'm also fine with 90%. I'm looking at this and trying to decide whether the 90 to the 95 gives us more actionable information, and I don't see a whole lot of difference between column 3 and column 4 and column 5 and column 6 in terms of actionable information, but it does remind me of something that last time we had this strategic framework, goals and metrics, discussion that the superintendent said, which is that if we're going to have a goal, we have to have a plan. And I guess that in terms of attendance, I eagerly await the plan, because I know that some of our efforts in the past have not been terribly successful. And I will also just kind of put in a plug for one of my favorite things our district has done, which is that there are more than a handful of classroom action research projects from 15 to 20 years ago on increasing student attendance. And I know that because I assigned my students to randomly pick classroom action research projects this year, and 2 or 3 of them picked attendance-related ones. So worth looking at.
Sure. Thanks. All right.
Anyone want to fight for 95 before we, before we go? All right, on to African American metrics.
Sounds good. So the reason we're talking about this tonight is that our additional suggestions that we brought in December didn't have specific metrics associated with that goal for African American children and youth. The idea at that time that we had discussed was being really conscious about disaggregation, presentation, and analysis of that data for the specific metrics we talked about already, not using specific metrics in addition associated with that goal. And we heard the feedback that no, we wanted to explore what some specific metrics could look like there. So one thing I will mention before we talk about the metrics themselves, we're working on the language of this goal too. What you saw in December was just a draft, and we're continuing to work on that and think about what we wanted to express. Right now we're thinking maybe it's better stated as something like African American children and youth will excel in school. Again, that's just something we're continuing to think through and work on. Just wanted to give you a heads up on that. So what we've done here is we have tried to come up with a limited set of metrics that is not too duplicative of some of the other metrics we've talked about, and reflects this idea that we do want to see excellence in school across student groups, and making sure that we're setting a high bar. So we've looked for metrics where we think that there are disparities that currently exist, where we have opportunities for improvement and opportunities for African American students to succeed. We want to emphasize high expectations. We want to avoid reinforcing negative stereotypes. And we want to make sure that we're not measuring things here that we're already talking about measuring associated with other goals. So with that in mind, I'll give a quick run through of what we're thinking about here. Some of these are things that have been suggested by this group. Some are things that we think the data would lead us to consider. So the first metric we're thinking about is something around school readiness. What you see as an example here is that Pell's kindergarten fall literacy assessment, so basically an assessment that students are taking as soon as they begin kindergarten, how they're coming as learners. Again, mentioned earlier, we might want to explore a little bit whether Pell's is our primary literacy assessment or whether we want to think about some other options. So we're likely to continue to explore that, but the general spirit is school readiness.
Yeah, and a reminder that PALS literacy is not a school readiness assessment. It is a literacy assessment.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the second metric we're thinking about here is those advanced learner identification rates. So what percentage of students are identified as advanced learners in any domain for which they're receiving services. The third metric is using grade 9 on track. And I'll pause here briefly and explain how this is slightly different. Over the last 5 years, we've been using a 9th grade metric around the percent of students that have had an F in, or the equivalent of a failing grade in 2 or more classes. What we're thinking about here is the grade 9 on track system that you may have heard people in our schools talking about, that we implemented over the past couple years. That's being used in schools, and this is kind of a more robust measure of being on track. It reflects grades, credit attainment, attendance, discipline, GPA. Yep. So it's basically those 5 measures going into an aggregate of whether we think students are on track to graduate in 4 years or not. We'd worked internally to run some models and see what kind of variables seem to be predictive. Also looked at some research being done on 9th grade on track models in other places that have shown success. So just noting here, the spirit is being on track to graduate at the end of 9th grade. It's a little different from the metric we've been using over the last 5 years, but we think it's a little more robust picture of what it means to be on track to graduate. The fourth metric here is, at the high school level, an advanced coursework participation rate. So what we're thinking about when we say advanced coursework here is not just advanced placement courses and honors courses, but things like youth options, dual credit programs, as well as those courses that are designated as just having an advanced level of content but may not be AP or honors. And finally, in our goal number 2 suggestions, we looked at this idea of power questions. So here we're thinking about a power question within the student climate survey. And so really what we did is we looked at last year's climate survey results, and we looked at African American students' responses relative to their peers. And so we just looked to see which questions do African American students tend to have less positive responses than their classmates. The good news in there is that there are a lot of questions where African American students really had very positive things to say. This question here, the adults at my school respect the students, that's the question where African American students were least likely to agree relative to their peers. So that's why that's the question that we think about here, because it's where we see the biggest disparity right now.
Before you pass it back, Bo, I would want to emphasize that this particular set of metrics, which would be a supplement to all the disaggregated data on all the other metrics we just discussed, this meeting and last meeting, are really designed to put the onus on us, right? This is not about measuring what students are doing, but what we are doing to make sure that the African American children in Madison have the opportunities they deserve to excel in school. So that's the thinking behind this set.
Nikki?
Just wanted to reiterate what Jen said, that PALS is a literacy test, not a school readiness test. I've known quite a few children, both black, white, who frankly came into school and could not read. And that does not mean they are not aware of what things are. It means they haven't mastered reading yet. And I don't want to focus on, oh, they can't read how many 4-year-olds are. And I don't want to rely on that, because I think that's a measure that will just set people up for failure of, oh, they're behind. They're not behind. They're in kindergarten.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kate?
So I like the focus on excellence here. I really appreciate kind of bringing to life that equity with excellence idea and value for our district. I might suggest, Bo, on that number 2 AL identification rate. I just worry a little bit about it. I care a lot more about services delivered than identification, right?
Sure.
And both are important. So if there's a way to articulate number of students receiving tier 2 and 3 support, say, might demonstrate more accurately how we are offering those opportunities to children. And I will say, just as a, I feel really strongly that this is included here. We changed our cut-in group stores earlier this year to try to make our demographics kind of more accurately reflect in advanced learning what our district looks like and what kids are bringing to the table. And the number of African American students actually went down this year that were identified, despite us changing scores, the cutoff thresholds, right, which is incredibly frustrating. So I feel very strongly that this is a very high level metric. Yeah, it's mathematically impossible, but so I appreciate that that's here. I might also, I would be curious about a 4-year college matriculation rate. I mean, if our goal is college, career, community ready, that feels like a really powerful way to demonstrate that. And 2 other kind of ones, maybe in the spirit of sausage making, just to throw over the fence. One is 9th grade on track doesn't mean a whole lot to the public. And so in the spirit of that, keeping that an internal metric and having one that's more a public accountability metric, I might pick one that means something, because it's just hard to understand. And then I wonder if there isn't some value in also including something around at-risk here. So I appreciate the focus on excellence. I also wonder if there isn't some value in elevating the status of how we're thinking about kind of opportunity youth here. I don't know if that fits here or somewhere else, but it's relevant to the question. So I don't know.
Anna and then James.
Yeah, I do agree with Kate's position on the AL identification. I think there is a better way to capture that. I think it's not so much the label a student is receiving, but whether the services are increasing and accelerating outcomes. I think there's a little bit of a stigma there that we're placing on, because we're certainly not saying students identified to receive special education services or something like that. So that feels a little bit off to me. I'm also concerned about that at the elementary level for K through 8 when there are so few students that are captured within that. For this demographic group, that seems like we're missing a lot of kids, and I would like to know more about what's going on with this group and not focus on 8% of the students. I'd actually like to know what's going on with the other 90%. So those would just be my comments.
James?
What I like to see also is that a lot of the comments that the board members are making, that they're compiled, because I think the presentation here is the presentation we had prior to the break, and there was a lot of good comments that we had at our last meeting that board members made a lot of suggestions, and what I had hoped to see is that plus all the suggestions board members make. I see us in a process where we are compiling or maybe eliminating, and so for board members who made a lot of those good suggestions at the last meeting, I hope you remember what they are, because they're not compiled here. So some of these suggestions that people are making, you know, we need to compile them, because they may get lost if we don't. I mean, because there are some suggestions made, and I'm not sure that they're here from the last meeting that board members made, what we like to see in terms of some of the metrics, for example.
I think the vast majority are captured, James, so we'll go back, cross-reference, and show you all the suggestions. I think we can do that, what was incorporated and what maybe wasn't, and why.
You're saying they're incorporated here?
The vast majority were. I think we'd have to double-check and do our homework on it.
Yeah, and I don't remember if they may be there, because what I'm saying is that board members made, what I'm really asking is that board members remember some of the suggestions that they made.
I hear what you're saying.
And if they're not there, you know, so good. Because you know, I would like to make sure, because some of them I thought was really good, and I'm not sure that they're captured. I have no way, because I don't have the compilation of them, and for board members themselves to.
I think we can follow through on that, James.
Dean and then Mary.
In the goal, children and youth, are we talking about preschool work here? What does children and youth mean?
Did you want to? No, I mean, I think the idea there is, you know, as we're thinking about that spectrum of students, pre-K through 12, that children and youth is more inclusive terminology than just saying children.
Yeah, and just to be quite honest, Dean, as we've been gearing up for the next strategic framework, we've been trying to move away from just always using the term student, which feels a little impersonal, and using the term children and youth is just a constant reminder that that's who we serve. So.
Well, then, do we do anything preschool?
Oh, in here, for pre-K, the metric has still continued to be, well, there was a proposal at the last meeting to do something on readiness, which is captured here. But I think part of the conversation we had at the last meeting, Dean, was about it's a real challenge, because there's so much, talk about volatility. I mean, there's a lot of what's called plasticity in learning in those early days. So to try to predict exactly what a student can attain in a year in kindergarten, it would not be advised by people who are experts in that area, because of the high level of plasticity in learning. So we've, for classroom-based assessments, formative-based assessments, there's a lot that teachers need to know in order to be responsive to students. But for an accountability system, there's a lot of risk in putting big metrics out there for really little kids. So. we're still grappling with that question, I think, for early childhood.
Mary and then me.
Yeah, I guess I have quite a few thoughts on most of these. Like Anna, one of my first impressions was that you have kindergarten, and then you have ninth grade on track, and the only metric is with regards to advanced learner, unless we do the climate one. And so it feels to me like we're really missing, and that's I think when we've already seen the gap by that time. And I think those are the critical years that in which we really have to be acting. So that's one comment. The literacy benchmark, if it's interesting, I'm not sure how much we affect that. So I'm and whether that's, if we're going to pick 5 metrics, that one we don't have a huge amount of impact over is one that we would focus on. I really like the 9th grade on track. I think that it sounds like actually something that someone would.
That makes sense.
Like, if they're on track, that's good, right? Whether it actually shows that or not, but it sounds like it's, the regular person actually knows, I think, could identify more with that than proficiency. So I like it, especially if it actually measures, and it's, unfortunately, I think there is a fairly strong correlation with graduation. And so I think that I actually, it's one of my favorite of the ones that are put here. So that one I I think with Kate, something with regards to college is helpful, but the one I would suggest is the one that the data was shared with recently, which used National Student Clearinghouse data and showed what percentage of students are actually enrolling in 2 or 4 year college. And I certainly wouldn't make it a 4-year because well, we just signed a partnership with Madison College, and that's actually there's a lot to say that's a career track that for all students, regardless of demographic. So, and what that report showed is that while we've made incredible strides with Latino students in the last 5 years, we've made almost no progress with African American students, and I would love to see that metric, because we know we can move those numbers. We've done it with Latino students, but we need to do it with African American students. So I would be adding more around K-8 and actual literacy in math. I personally think proficiency or a tiered approach is important, and I think it's something that should involve so that you have people at the elementary level, you have people at the middle school, you have people at the high school. High school, I think if you have 9th grade on track and you have the enrollment in college, you have 2 really strong metrics to be focused on. But I think that we need something much more targeted, K-8.
I think we'll have to really think about that, because part of our challenge is not to simply duplicate the metrics that are already in the set, because we already measure literacy, mathematics. We just talked about measuring growth. That would all be disaggregated for African American youth. So yeah.
Jen, can I ask a question there? Because I thought the purpose of having this was to focus our attention on additional efforts, not that we're counting more things. In fact, I think it'd be okay to duplicate, but what it is saying we're going to set specific emphasis for African American students on these. And in fact, so tell me why you think they should be different.
Our original proposal was that they would not be. that would be precisely the same metrics, but just kind of amping up attention on African American student results. Based on our last discussion, we talked about whether or not it would be powerful to, in addition to that same set of metrics, to pick just a small number of additional metrics that would be more about not just outcomes, but opportunities, right? That we're really pushing on not simply improvement of outcomes, but taking action to open up opportunities for students who clearly have had a really hard time getting them. So that was the idea. So this was meant to be a supplemental small set. I mean, it could be 3 metrics, right? It doesn't have to even be this long. In addition to amping up the African American results on Goal 1.
With
and Goal
that,
2.
would you consider then putting under Goal 3 some of the key ones from other areas that we feel? Because otherwise what it reads to me is when we say we will accelerate progress for our African American children and youth, we're then looking at these.
You could
only.
Yep. Yeah, so in other words, you could, underneath that 3rd goal, can you, my computer died.
Oh.
Could you go back to
Are you,
that,
which one?
Just the
what it
overall
says?
slide. Yeah, this one. You could put underneath Goal 3, every African American child is on track to graduate ready for college, career, community, right? Every child, African American child is thriving, right? Like you could repeat these 2, and in addition have those few additional, are you guys following me? Those few additional metrics. That would, I think, get to your point, that we're lifting up how African American children are doing as it relates to Goal 1 and 2, and holding ourselves accountable for opportunity for excellence.
And would you set specific targets then on those?
Yeah, we certainly could.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
No, I think that connects actually really well to the spirit of what we did initially bring in December.
Yeah.
And I think that helps us think too that there's the conversation around goals and metrics and what we want to use moving forward, and then there's also planning to do around presentation and the way that we want to make those results available and public, and the way that we want to collectively dig into them. So I think, Mary, what you're talking about, we can partially solve through presentation as well.
Okay, good.
All right, I'm just going to walk through from the top left clockwise very quickly and try and do it very briefly. I agree with a lot of things, people who said that that when we have 8% of students identified as advanced learners in African American students, that this is a very small percentage. I understand we have a need for a K-8, and I think that receiving services and things like that might help with this, but we're still talking an extremely small percentage. And I would, this got me thinking about, well, where is the largest percentage of African American students? And I think that perhaps for African American students, in addition to the excellence ones, we should also be monitoring and having a push to minimize those scoring below basic. To say that, and that's the metric we say. What is the percentage scoring below basic? Because right now it bops around the high 50s and the low 60s. And, and sending a message that this is unacceptable, and that our goal is to get that down to 0, but certainly, year in and year out, to get down by 5-10 points a year instead of the proficient and above, because to me that's where one of the crises is in our community is functional illiteracy, and kids are going year to year, and that is a racialized crisis. So that's number 1. Number 2, I like the on track to graduate. The PALS falls literacy. PALS fall literacy. I agree with Mary that that's something we don't have a lot of control of. Perhaps instead of K, do that first grade. Then they've been with us for a year, right? And we're already doing it, or whatever that test is. On the climate question, I understand where you took the greatest disparity between all students and African American students. This is a question that's only been asked once. And I'd be more comfortable if that was done with a question that had been repeated multiple times, and say which is the one that has the highest average, And we lose this potential question because it's a brand-new question, but we also, I think, open us up to something that's more consistent in showing differences. So I'd like to at least see what those other questions might be. For advanced course participation, I'd much rather see advanced course success, grade B or better or something like that. Signing up is signing up. It's half the battle. It's not the whole battle. So that's my around the world set of commentaries. Nikki.
Just one other thing. I understand we use PALS, but I also would be wondering if we can do a assessment for those who are nonverbal. Right now, that it's highly verbal based, and there are a large number of children who may not be. That doesn't mean they are not intelligent. It means they're not verbal.
James.
Yeah, I agree with you on advanced coursework, but maybe the compromise would be advanced coursework, participation, and success.
Yeah.
Oh, that would work.
Yeah, sure.
Laura
Laura
first, and then I'll go.
So I guess hearing what you guys are saying about wanting to focus on services being delivered, and going back to what Mary said about how the district has seen larger gains with Hispanic and Latino students, I'm wondering if it would be good to look at African American participation or enrollment, I'm not quite sure the right word, in programs like AVID and TOPS or the People program that I know have definitely been responsible for a lot of the Hispanic students that are my friends in advanced classes. They've said that really helped them out a lot, and that that's like a good community and really helpful for the post-secondary success. So I think that could be a good thing to look at if we're wanting to really focus on accelerating rather than just measuring or like bolding it in the advanced learning plan. It's just I think it's a little different.
I was just going to make a quick comment on the school readiness piece. I think similar, so I think I threw out this idea last time, and similar to the attendance one for me, this is an action driver. So it's only valuable to include this metric if we want to choose to invest incrementally in 4K, I think, right? And if that's not something that we as a group have energy for, then I would agree we don't have a lot of control at this point over readiness. So the reason to include it would be a commitment to action, the same for truancy, right? Yeah. And I'm excited for the attendance metrics because I think we do need to commit to acting on attendance and truancy. So more of a reflection.
All right, other thoughts on African American goals and metrics? Then I would like to open up the floor to the what's missing discussion. Or the, and just, I know that some of this captures some of the things that James was talking about that we brought up at the last meeting. And it wasn't clear what kind of support there was among the board. I think that we're also open to things that have occurred to people since then. But as I said at the beginning of the meeting, that putting new things on the table has to stop really, really soon. Yeah. So Kate seems to have a couple things on mind. I know I have a couple, and I don't know if anyone else does, but let's go with it.
Yeah, no.
Go, Kate.
So I think the one that I threw out last time that I didn't see in here was really around thriving workforce. And I've been reflecting on this one. I feel like we might want to add a goal here as a fourth objective, right? Every organization, business I know of has talent or employee engagement or kind of workforce as a top agenda item, and we are only as good as the educators in our buildings. And so I feel like we might want to articulate a goal here of having, and I don't know the best language, but a goal of having a talented and valued workforce, right? That can thrive, or you guys sort out the language, it's terrible, right? And that it would have a couple of metrics underneath it. One of them we might be able to get at with the power questions we've got already around kind of getting at that morale idea. One of them, I would really like to have a teachers of color metric, absolute number, not hirees, so that we can account for churn. and maybe something around retention, I don't know, but I would just keep a couple of metrics in there that could kind of paint a holistic picture of basically that this is a great place to work, right? We want our district to be the best place to work in anywhere within driving distance so that we can have the best educators, because that's basically the thing that matters most for all of our kids. So I would like the metrics to reflect that, you know, if I knew those things, I as a teacher or as an educator or as an SEA, that I would hands down pick here every time. So I think it's a strong message also to just the workforce. So I think that I'd be curious what other people think about kind of creating a goal there. And then the second one, I was kind of trying to reflect on whether these felt overall too much like progress metrics to me and not enough like indicators of success, right? Like, it's a lot to absorb, and it's not that easy to absorb based on what we've talked about. Are we doing well, right? Just simple, like, are we a district that people want to go to? And so I wondered if adding the open enrollment rate as a metric somewhere might be a very simple way to understand in a very simple way, right? People vote with their feet. Do people want to come to Madison as a district, right? Are we the best district around? Do we have a net inflow or outflow of students? I think that's an important thing for us to know and keep kind of, I don't know, our feet on the ground. We live in a competitive environment. People can choose where they send their kids to school. And I want people to want to choose to send their kids to school here because we are the best district for all children, right? So I don't know if there's another metric that gets at that, but open enrollment's really simple. And I think so those are the two that I was going to throw out.
Nikki.
One on open enrollment, I think that's an excellent idea. I've wanted to do something on the open enrollment for a long time. We do have people who do leave. We don't know why they leave. We don't do an exit interview. We don't necessarily find out. And I would love to know. My other issue is on the teaching. I understand why we want excellent, talented teachers. Here's the problem. I want a teacher who can teach all students. I don't want a teacher who is Cubs glowingly recommended and can teach the A+ advanced learner, very narrow band. I want a teacher who can handle all different ones. I'm not sure that shows up on anything but a performance evaluation. I don't think that you could have a degree in that. I think the only thing that can do that is experience. But that's my opinion, so I'm not sure I'd do a metric on that.
Okay, I'm going to make a quick comment and then James. On the open enrollment, if we go that way, I think that we probably would have to include private and homeschooling enrollment as some kind of thing, just because you know, the shifting options people have, right? You know, I mean, if a new private school opens up, then open enrollment might, you know, right? So that's just a quick comment on that. And James had something.
You know, I was just going to ask the question. I guess I don't see open enrollment as being simple. So, you know, it's fair. It could be, I think it's more of a dependent variable. I mean, there's a lot of things that goes into open enrollment. So, I'm not saying it would be a bad metric. I'm just, some of these things I think have to think a little more about. And, but I think it's good to get it on the table.
Yeah, I mean.
I just think open enrollment is a dependent variable and, you know, what goes into that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it's the best metric. I mean, the spirit of the question was to try to capture in a very simple way in one number that people got, do people want to come to MMSD? And so, you know, and are we moving, what's the trend on that? And so you guys, I'm sure, have many more metrics at your disposal than we're going to think of right now. But I think some of the metrics we're talking about, you know, K through 5, this grade, that grade, they get really progress oriented, and they don't tell us simple, like, we're a place that people want to send their kids. We're a place that people want to move, you know, like.
Anna and then Mary.
Just going back to what Laura had talked about in regard to African American students, I know we're identifying the advanced coursework, advanced learner as a threshold, but I would wonder if we could look at playing with something where we're actually saying opportunities for accelerated academic achievement. Are we providing different opportunities, services to accelerate achievement for African American students, because then I think that captures a wide range of students, and it's not just focusing on advanced learning services, because it's going to look different for different students. And I agree with you, Laura, because I heard that very clearly too, that when we were talking with the student group, there were subsets of students that students themselves identified could not access any additional supports or services to accelerate achievement. They were kind of just stuck where they're at, and I think that's a real problem. And in regard to the power questions, I know we talk a lot about belonging. And I don't know if we would want to dig a little bit deeper, but particular with the African American students even coming out and saying, I can identify 2 adults in my school that I have a connection with.
Well, that would work.
Something where you're really getting to that. And I think that ties into what we've been talking about in regard to relationship building and connections. We really want our students to have people that connect them to the school.
Mary. I'm just going to piggyback on Anna's point there. It's interesting because I recently saw data that broke out some of the student questions around belonging and about adults in the school. I forget what they were, but it broke it out for the at the top students from the general high school. And what was interesting to me was they weren't significantly better. And yet you hear from students about how much they feel that they have this almost family and the support around the program. And when we discussed it, I think what people thought was they were commenting on the whole school, right? So it wasn't that they didn't have 1 or 2 adults, but they may have felt that outside of the program, they really didn't have that, or they didn't have it in general. So I think we have to be sure about what question we ask, because if it's 1 or 2 adults, I'm not sure that having just 1 or 2 adults among your entire high school is actually going to drive a sense of belonging. So I think I just want to know more about that and make sure it's actually a driver of whether a student succeeds.
And just a comment, and I agree, Mary, I'm really interested too to see who students identify with as that connected adult, because through the work on the ERO committee, what I'm finding is a lot of our students are connecting with the behavioral support staff,
Right,
the school security assistants, the educational resource officers, and I think that's an interesting trend, and how are we getting these students to connect with other staff, like the teachers in their classrooms.
Yeah, okay, so we're on the same, I had more comments.
Keep
but
going.
Is it on this topic, Laura? Okay, then defer to.
There was we did at West, I don't know if this was at the other 4 high schools, but an EOS survey, and it asked specifically about, there were a couple questions where it asked to name specific teachers. So I don't know if like that data would be helpful in this process, because I can definitely like second that and what you said about who people are connecting with. But if you like wanted specific like names of people and like which students, I think that would be a good.
And then back to some of the points that had been made. I agree with Kate that having some type of metric about whether people are choosing our school and whether our district and whether that's improving is really important. We're benefiting in Madison right now from increased new construction, increased values. That's been able to help support increased spending. But once that slows down, and it's going to at some point, the only other way to increase our funding generally is by having increasing enrollment, unless we want to keep going back to referendum. And I believe we could be a district, even without a lot of new building, we could be a district that over the long term adds 5,000 students. And so I think something that is aspirational around that is, or at least gets us thinking about that, is important. With regards to the staff, Kate, I agree with you in terms of the goal. I thought the power question around whether I look forward to coming to work every day is a really good one. And I think that it very much measures the general level of satisfaction and so I would, because I think there's the other metrics get really complicated, like how do you really say you have the best workforce? I think that one is when people are enjoying coming to work, I think that we will retain people, and we will certainly attract people to the district. It doesn't necessarily mean we're hiring the best people, but I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to step in for a second and then Dean, because there's 3 or 4 things I want to comment on. One is that I can see the attraction of some sense of what Kate was trying to get at with open enrollment numbers. I'm also a little wary of it, so I'm kind of open and kind of in an undecided place on that. I do think something around retention and things like that would be good, and many districts do that. And I also think that, you know, we might also want to consider something around, in addition to teachers of color, also something around fully qualified staff, because we have. You know, I noticed that I sent out today the metrics that Evanston uses, and they use percentage of bilingual certified and special education certified as one of their metrics, because this is a place where we have identified a need for improvement. As a general place, I really like the discussion around the opportunities available to students, and I think that if we're going to go in that direction, the one that Anna started and Laura and Mary continued with, I do think also that we need to be aware of something that's come up in partnerships, which is that we have 6, 7, 8 programs to support students, and the same 200 students are taking advantage of these 6 programs. And that, as Anna said, that there are students who can't access things, and, you know, and it's great, and these students are doing well, and I don't want to take away any supports from them, but kind of the diversity of supports available and the diversity of students being reached by this, because you know, it is, and they're all claiming success for these same students. I mean, you know, it's like the People program and Avid, it's, you know, it's and they're all like, see how great we did, and, you know, I don't know which of your 6 programs did great, or was it the combination? If that's what it takes, then we have to acknowledge that that's what it takes, and maybe we need 6 dozen programs. But something around that is something that I think's important. Those are my comments on the things around the table. I think I've got 3 things I want to throw on the table, but I think let Dean do this and then come back to that, and we'll try and wrap this up soon.
I have doubts that on the open enrollment issue, I have doubts we get reliable information on people that enroll out and why they did. I think we could figure out a way to get good information on why people would enroll in. But I doubt the reliability of people getting good information on why people enroll out.
And we do have a survey.
And we do get the data every year on.
Andrew.
Well, that's why I doubt we get reliable information. I think it'd be really difficult to get, and I don't think it'd be reliable. I would really have to see how we do that, and I don't know if it's worth spending the time.
Is that all right if Andrew responds to this? Because we do a survey, and I want to clarify some things that we do know.
We did one survey of open enrollment leavers, and that did include known private parochial students, homeschool students, and students that left to another district through the state program. We did that a couple of years before I got here, so about 9 years ago, and then we did another one, I think, 2 school years ago. So we can recirculate the findings from that.
Very recent,
Yeah, fairly recent. Your questions around response rate and those kinds of things would be embedded in the summaries that we prepared. So I'll dust those off and recirculate them.
What you're saying, I think what...
I'm saying honesty.
No, I'm just saying honesty.
The reliability, the honesty of the answers, I think is what...
Especially for the
you know, you got the surveys and you get the... But there's... you know, do people really tell the whole truth about why they leave? And I think is what you're getting at.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think, right, I'm familiar with the surveys and all of that, but what Dean is getting at is totally different. Yeah, we answer the questions, but I'm not going to really put this on the survey is what you're
What are the code words? What are the,
Yeah, I get what you guys are saying.
I'm going to throw 3 things out here for things that I would like to see at least considered. One of which is that is an old one, which is, I think, which is some form of well-roundedness. I think that we all agreed that the K-5 well-rounded measure was a waste of time. Everybody got 100%, and that was just swell. The middle school one was only a little bit better. I think the high school one is actually very useful. And so I would like us to consider something, because I think that, you know, we've had earlier discussions tonight about not teaching the test, and that there's more to it than this. And and I think that, you know, exposure to the arts, world languages, electives and things like that are something that we should still, in our strategic framework, our statement about what's important. I think we should continue to have something there. And again, I don't like the old measures, but that doesn't mean that the idea isn't good. I'm going to throw the three things out. The second one is that I looked at the ELL plan update today, and I have no way to interpret the access score, the percentage at different access levels. And I think that with a growing population of ELL students, that some measure of ELL's achieving English proficiency might be worth considering. It is our legal obligation to bring them to English proficiency, and, you know, biliteracy is one of our goals, but we have a legal obligation around the other. So, and then the third is this idea of differences among our schools. And I floated this last time. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about it now, but not at any great length. I think that we understand that we have inequalities among our students in both opportunities and in outcomes. And I think we also recognize that we have inequalities among our schools. We try to get at the inequalities among our students by breaking things down by subgroup and doing these categories and getting separate reporting on that. I think that if we want to be successful as a district, part of this involves trying to minimize the inequalities among our schools. And if we only use district-wide metrics, what we see is that success at one school can disguise decline at another school. Success at a set of 5 schools can disguise decline at another set of 5 schools. It can happen very easily. The difference in what I'm talking about tonight is that what I think is we should take some number of the general strategic framework metrics, and just as we do the subgroup reporting on it, report some measure of the distribution among our schools, some measure of heteroscedity, some measure of the range. I don't, you know, there's a variety of different ways you can talk about how a data set is distributed. And to say that, you know, that if we're talking about 5th grade proficiency, this is, you know, that, and this is distributed among the inequalities among our schools are captured in this measure. If we're talking about climate survey, the power question, the differences among our schools are captured in this way. I think that, and I think it's got to be more than just test scores. I think it's got to be things like climate and things like that have to be included also. So that's my pitch on that. I sent out just, you know, some illustrations of it earlier this week. Maybe it was even today. And just to, you know, just to say that these differences are real, and I think when we sit here at the top at the board level, part of our job is to address these inequalities among our schools. Nobody else can do it. Last point on this is that we partially do this, we attempt to do this by labeling schools high intensity, medium intensity, and light touch. But we don't have any sense of whether this has been successful or not. We don't say, you know, are schools moving from light from heavy to light? We don't do that in any systematic way, and we don't include that in the strategic framework. And so we do have kind of a plan around this. So that's my pitch, and I'd love to hear what other people have to say. Nikki.
It's not a pitch. I just thought of one thing that I would like to add, if that's okay.
All right.
And that would be on special education. We hear that it's individualized, and I'm all for that. But right now, we have throughout the country, we don't have the highest graduation rates. I'd like to have an academic measure for individuals who are special needs, because right now we don't have one. And I think, to be honest, it would help. Right now, in the courthouse, we have a term which isn't real flattering. It's referred to as graduating by IEP. And very simply, I understand the point, but frankly, there are a large number of students with disabilities who can learn more, but we're not challenging them, and I think that needs to be addressed.
Dean.
You triggered something that was on my mind in the BEP report we got last week also is we're not seeing historic high referrals. We're seeing upticks in rising referral rates. And one of the things, similarly to how that data can get skewed, is if it's how many referrals are from frequent flyers to say. And I asked to see that once before, but I'd like to see that regularly in this report. The middle school was up 15%. How many of how many kids have 5 or more referrals? And I think that also tends to do, like what TJ was suggesting, skew the data in some cases. And we know about the high flyers. We hear about it in every school. And you know, now that reporting is getting a little bit more consistent, that might be some of the reason why we saw an increase. But you know, those unusual high flyers that we spend a lot of attention on, what does that do to our numbers there? And that's okay. But we should know that, and I'd like, because a 15% increase at middle school doesn't mean that got 15% more kids getting referred. So I'd like to see that broken down a little too.
Just various board members have referred to a number of reports that the board has received in the last couple of weeks. We've received monitoring reports on the special education plan, the English language learner plan, and updated BEP behavioral education plan. I don't know if those have been posted on the research and accountability page yet, but for those at home, I assume they will be eventually. And so, because there's just been a lot of, I mean, we've been, you know, these have come up from various people, and just to clarify for those who haven't seen these reports we're discussing. Kate?
So I guess maybe to respond to both Dean and TJ, one of the other things we had discussed last time, I'd thrown out a behavior metric or goal, and I think we didn't land on anything concrete because it's really challenging to identify what that might be. I just figured I'd throw it back out there since it isn't in anything here, if there had been any thought or discussion on your end about that.
We'll summarize all the ideas that have been put out there, this meeting and last. We'll share with you our analysis, whether or not we think they should be included or not in the set of metrics and goals. You take it for what it is. We don't always agree on everything, I realize that. I do want to remind everyone, every idea has value. And ultimately, we cannot have an accountability system that is so unwieldy that we cannot focus our efforts, right? Because to your earlier point, which was my point last time, for every goal that we set, there have to be actions aligned to it. And the broader and more complex we make this accountability system, the less likely we're actually going to make progress towards our goals. So I want us to keep it tight and focused and actionable. And remember that the district level accountability system aligns to the school level accountability system. So for every big district goal we're setting, a principal and their leadership team is going to be grappling with their own goal setting related to the multitude of goals that we've set at the district level. And so so we will do this analysis and come back about what we believe is the most powerful. And I've heard a lot of good things tonight that I think will make this proposal, which is yours, much stronger. And we can't probably fit every single good idea into the system without making it unwieldy. And doesn't mean we don't look at that data and
No,
it's not
it's
used
totally
at the
fair.
school level. It's just really important to grapple with. I think the workforce goal interests me a lot. We've talked about that before. I think that's really worth exploring. Yeah, so definitely
Can you
some good
talk
ideas.
about the behavior? Because I agree with Kate, and I think that we don't, unless I miss something, it doesn't feel like we have anything around that. And yet, it's such a big part of everything that we have been doing. And I think as I visit the schools, I hear about it affects the learning of all students. It affects the climate
You don't have
for
to
every
explain it to me.
teacher. Right.
Yeah, I know.
And so
Well aware.
just having something, it
Yeah.
seems like there's a place for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a huge part of the data that we
Yeah.
look at regularly. We do not just an annual report, which is what we do for the strategic framework, we do a quarterly public report on our behavior data. So in many ways, it is the most public source of data and driving force in the district right now. So let's put that out there. But,
Yeah, but I mean, I think if we think about this as our public commitment to be the district that we want to
Right.
be, right? I think having a place that your children can show up and be learners is part of that commitment.
Yeah, it's a
And
climate
in
and
different way,
culture
like, parents
goal.
don't ask about growth by and large. A few people here probably understanding, but like parents are interested in, is the school a warm, welcoming place? You know, I think
Right,
so.
and the second goal that you set is all about that. So it's a matter of just looking at the metric. Right now, we've got the power questions as the proposal for how to measure that. And so this will help us, you know, think about whether or not just those metrics on their own are enough. Yeah, so, yeah, that's
I was
good.
going to respond to your other idea
Yeah,
as
I'm
well.
going to respond to yours real quick, is that I would also like to see at least a proposed behavior question, because I have no idea what, or
Yeah.
goal, because I have no idea what it
Metric,
would look
yeah.
metric. And so I guess that's it. Now, Kate, back to you.
Then can I
on your
respond?
Then Nikki.
just on your thought around school differentiation, I'm
Variance.
curious, variance. I'm curious about a reflection of whether the way that we distribute our resources in a differentiated way has the impact that we want, right? We have a very differentiated way to distribute per pupil funding per school based on needs, and those choices are very material to the building. So I would be curious about something. I'm not sure if it lives here or somewhere else.
Right. I think
And I wouldn't
yeah.
do it for anything more than one metric, because I think it's a lot of work. But I do think that as an evaluation of our workbook process and the equity tool, equity staffing charts, some way to understand if that input produces kind of comparable outputs. The reason to give different schools different resources is to equalize outcomes in some sense and opportunities, right? So I would be curious if that's happening.
And I just want to comment that that's a huge motivation behind why I would like to see this, is that if we are doing this differentiation in resources correctly, are we doing it enough? Are we doing those kind of questions? I think that and is there a greater need? And I think that this would spur us to think about that. Secondly, I would like to see at least two metrics, one of which was not test score based. That's why, like a climate metric or something like that. Just something where this didn't exist as just pressure to raise test scores at our lower scoring schools.
Yep.
I mean, so that's
fair.
just my
No, it's
that's where
fair.
I'm from that. Nikki?
My issue, I understand behavior drives everything, and I understand that. My issue on behavior metric is this. Right now, we are having more suspensions, out of school suspensions, and that I'm afraid if we have a very narrow behavior monitor, we're going to focus more on punishment and less on intervention. And that's what my fear is. Right now, we have a behavior education plan that is about 70-plus pages with 17 pages of intervention, the rest punishment. I'm not sure that's really an equal balance. And I'm afraid if we put a behavior metric without fixing that first, we may worsen that problem.
I think we need to wrap this up.
I think that would be a good idea.
And we will be returning to this on February 5th. We will be continuing to discuss the things that were on the table tonight, and additionally the forward versus MAP, the ACT versus Aspire versus GPA, the climate power questions, which came up tonight in some discussion, and the PALS early literacy assessment, early school readiness assessments. And that will be on February 5th. We will work towards finalization in February of 2018. And I was also asked by someone to say among the next steps, it says collect teacher and staff feedback, that if we could have some kind of sharing about what opportunities teachers and staff will have to give feedback on the goals and metrics would be, and I sent them in response the generalized strategic framework feedback information, but they were looking for something more specific around the goals and metrics. So if you can share that with the board, I can pass that along.
Yeah.
With that in mind, I will entertain a motion to adjourn, and we have another meeting afterwards.
Moved.
Second.
Laura, your advisory.
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye. Can we have 5 minutes before the start of the next one?
I'm not chairing the second meeting, so that's not my...
Mary?
James is
Or
chairing.
James, may we have 5?
We can have 3.
Thank you.
Congratulations are underway.
James, do you want to talk for a second?
to recommend that we stay in a period of adjournment and that we cancel this next section because it's, I don't think that it's, you know, we've gone over 2 hours with the first section and it's supposed to be an hour. And the subject matter of the next one can't be postponed, and I don't think we're really prepared here tonight to, or we need to spend energy on the next section. So my recommendation is that we not do the second part of the meeting tonight, so that we have more time to think about that second part. It's really was going to be a brainstorming section.
It's going to be brainstorming,
so,
yeah.
But it's something that we can move to a later time. It's just we're going to be brainstorming around the strategic framework and some, you know, give people some ideas. So, or get ideas from the board. So
it's already on.
I second it.
So it's been, so we're in adjournment already. So I'm basically saying that I'm not going to adjourn the next meeting.
Got
And
it.
if anyone have severe, real heartburn over it, we all know our emails. You have my email, but as of right now we're in adjournment and we're going to stay there. So